For as long as it's existed, Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid series has located itself under the shadow of World War II. In this video, we'll be looking at only several examples.
Heavily armed soldiers occupied Shadow Moses Island, a remote island off the coast of Alaska.
1998's MGS-1 took players to the Aleutian Island chain off the coast of Alaska. As recounted in Brian Garfield's The Thousand Mile War, the Aleutians were a real battlefield during the Pacific War. The islands are in some of the most inhospitable territory on Earth, making the fighting there particularly grueling.
What's the insertion method?
Well, an air insertion is impossible.
Not with this storm going on.
We'll approach the disposal facility by sub.
Garfield's narrative of what he calls the Forgotten War is full of material any MGS-1 fan would recognize, with its tales of submarine warfare, impenetrable storms, and toe-to-toe combat amidst frozen wastes. And much like the events of MGS-1, in fact, though the events on the Aleutians are scarcely of note compared to other, much more famous battles and fronts, their actual impact is of very great consequence. The Japanese forces divided themselves in order to fight over the islands, which made it easier to defeat them elsewhere in the Pacific. And because the Japanese were ultimately thwarted in the Aleutians, quote, the Aleutian campaign gave the US its first theater-wide victory of the Second World War. Japan's adventure in the Western Hemisphere was ended. At first, Japan had threatened America's northern flank. Now the Allies threatened Japan's. End quote. That brings us to the focus found first in 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty on the importance for World War II and the post-war era of signals intelligence and secret projects. Because the precursor to today's NSA had already cracked the Japanese cipher prior to Pearl Harbor, when the US entered the war, they began with a major advantage in terms of code breaking and also counterintelligence. The Japanese were unsurpassable in one-on-one battle, yet they lacked much of what they needed for victory. Their totalitarian society disincentivized individualism or independent thought, which led to serious problems related to groupthink and a culture of shame and silence. Considering themselves a superior race, meanwhile, the Japanese did not deign to build a strong logistics capability. And this inability to get enough materiel and even food to where it was needed carried over to how the Japanese spread, organized, and obtained information. Because their co-belligerents in Berlin and Rome did not believe in teamwork, the Japanese were basically left on their own. Worst maybe of all, the Japanese Empire, much like the Nazis, vastly underestimated the US's capacity for mobilizing, and in general, the decisive role that intelligence, not raw fighting strength or determination, would play in this war. So the huge project of secretly cracking the Japanese naval codes directly led to the other big secret project aimed at Japan by the end of the war, the Manhattan Project.
It's the only system in the world with an optic neural AI that has a parallel processing capacity of 980 trillion Hammets.
I suppose that being a specialist in neural AI and complex logic played a significant role in your association with the Metal Gear project.
Complex mathematical modeling and machines built by IBM would prove instrumental to both projects. And from these important projects, which pulled together a diverse array of specialists from disciplines all across the spectrum for the first time, both the atomic and the computer ages would be born. This rise of American-led science, technology, and culture is all at the heart of MGS-2: Sons of Liberty.
The reason that tensions between East and West have settled into a Cold War is because each side fears the other's power. Deterrence. The idea of using threats to keep one's enemy in check is the perfect word to sum up this state of affairs.
Next, we should talk generally about the central concern for not only the third game, 2004's MGS3 Snake Eater, but in general for every Metal Gear game, the concern over Doomsday Weapons capable of unbelievably rapid mass murder, weapons that in their destructiveness make no distinction between enemy and friend, soldier and civilian. Though World War I began this trend towards an increasing importance for such methods, it was not until World War II that these nightmarish inventions truly became a mainstay of modern warfare. Beginning with the Spanish Civil War and culminating with Italy's gassing of Abyssinia, the Nazi Blitzkrieg, and of course Pearl Harbor, World War II saw the rise of aerial warfare, bombings, and rapid sieges unlike ever in history. From the bomber armada to the tank battalion, and later the Allies and their so-called super fortresses, World War II was full of weaponry that we can directly compare to the titular robot found in every Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear.
Are you familiar with the theory of the missing link between apes and humans? Well, this technology will be the missing link between infantry and artillery. A kind of Metal Gear, if you will.
In World War I, planes had first been used for aerial recon and dogfights only, while tanks were devised mainly as troop and supply transport vehicles used to penetrate machine gun nest-equipped front lines. It wasn't until World War II these marvels of modern mass industrial production became instruments of mass destruction, culminating obviously with the atomic bomb. MGS3 sought out to examine the origins of the age that these rapid mass murder weapons fostered, the age called the Cold War, where, out of deference to these weapons, a new clandestine and regional proxy form of warfare was out of necessity born. But MGS3 was maybe more invested in World War II than any game in this series, unlike its follow-up, 2008's MGS4, which set out to make a point about how much war had changed in the 21st century. However, MGS4 would feature many elements of a classic Hollywood World War II epic, including a big final naval battle that involved a real World War II-era battleship, the USS Missouri. This was the last such vessel constructed during the war, and it served as the site of Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though whether those bombings were for the Japanese or merely to intimidate the neighboring Soviet Union is a subject that remains up for debate. If this video gets enough of a positive reaction, I'll do a follow-up about the use of Navajo code talkers, holy war, and even weaponized parasites on the Eastern Front of World War II. But for now, I'll end with arguably among the two most important outfits for MGS from that war, both of them British, the SAS and the SOE.
Speaking of snakes, you remember the boss, don't you? A legendary soldier and your mentor. She's going to be serving as Fox's mission advisor.
The boss is?
She also helped me plan this mission. She and I were at SAS together.
The SAS, short for Special Air Service, were the original Special Operations Force, SOF, meaning the first one entirely trained and coordinated around missions that involved, say, sabotage, behind enemy lines penetration, and subterfuge. Formed to fight the Nazi forces in northern Africa, the SAS would parachute in miles behind the enemy's back and sneak up on them while their pants were down. By targeting strategic locations like airfields and by cutting supply lines and attacking outposts, the SAS managed to whittle down the Nazis' strength while sustaining mostly minimal casualties of their own. Eventually, the SAS would become the global standard bearer for all special operations, fundamentally and all but single-handedly changing the face of warfare forever. But far more secretive and sinister than the SAS, or Special Air Service, were the XOF to their Fox unit, Churchill's infamous Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the SOE, Special Operations Executive.
Shades of World War II.
If the SAS are famous and popular as heroes of the war, the SOE are far less well and widely known. Formed prior to America's entry in the war at a time of great desperation for the British Empire, the shadowy SOE played by no rules other than their given mission to, in Churchill's famous words, set Europe ablaze. The SOE did exactly that, attacking the Axis powers with every possible variety of asymmetrical secret warfare they could. This ranged from blowing up train lines to sneaking itching powder inside brothels to target the Nazis' genitalia, as well as a specifically built mechanism that would blow your groin apart the minute that you lifted the toilet seat. The SOE had the help of scientists and engineers, informally known as Churchill's magicians, as well as female spies and all manner of oddball operatives. Apart from conducting silent assassinations behind enemy lines, the SOE set to work stirring up resistance movements against the Axis powers, building underground armies to fight the Nazis tooth and nail. At the end of the war, many documents and records relating to SOE operations were burned, particularly, to quote The Politics of Strategic and Clandestine War, edited by Naval Wiley, quote, all docs referring to SOE activities in the Arab world, end quote. By the end of the war, the SOE's activities would span the entire globe. Well, that about does it for now. If I get enough likes and views for this video, I'll follow it up with an even better one that you won't want to miss. Until next time, boss.